about our series this month, The Light Has Come. So if you haven't been here this month, I'll just quickly recap the past 2 weeks. In week 1, we took the topic, comfort in the discomfort. Recognizing that many times in our lives we're experiencing dark times, we're experiencing challenging times, we're experiencing troubling times. And the thing that I shared with you there was actually we can find comfort even in the uncomfortable times, because we recognize that actually creation happens in darkness. Creation happens from that place that we cannot see. And so this is why in the book of Genesis we have that opening line of that creation happened out of the darkness, and God spoke the word, and then creation happens. And so we celebrate darkness, and we recognize that in December, with the winter solstice coming, we actually experience the darkest nights of the year. Last week, we talked about transition. Don't judge the chrysalis. Recognizing that transitions and change are a natural part of life. And when we judge those changes, when we judge transition and act like something is wrong, it would be like judging the sun for shining, because it's a natural part of life. It would be like judging the air for being here for us to breathe. It would be like a butterfly judging the chrysalis when we recognize that that period of time in its life, or the caterpillar, not the butterfly, it's becoming a butterfly as it's in that chrysalis. And so we move further into this week. And as I was preparing the message and as I was thinking about the message for this week, I thought of a concept that I learned from my coach that I worked with for some time a few years ago. And it's a term called a fraud complex. Now, if you don't know what a fraud complex is, this is my personal definition of a fraud complex. It's a paralyzing fear that people will think you're inauthentic, unqualified, or incapable of being or doing what you've chosen to do or be. In other words, a fraud. Now, what's the other thing that came to my mind when I thought about a fraud complex, it immediately took me to the Wizard of Oz. Because if you remember in the story of the Wizard of Oz, once they finally meet the wizard and we see what's going on, and we find out that actually all of the smoke and mirrors is just a man behind the curtain. We have that famous line, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. He was a fraud. And he had a complex. His complex was so great and so vast that he created this fictitious idea about being a wizard and created all these smoke and mirrors because he didn't believe that he was enough. He didn't believe that he had any power. Now, the way the fraud complex usually shows up in our lives, it usually shows up as a form of questions. And I was hearing different questions. The first and foremost is, who am I? There's something that you want to do and you feel like, I'm not worthy of this thing. Who am I to think that I can be in a loving relationship? Who am I to think that I can make $1 million? Who am I to think that I can have a family? Who am I to think that I can have this career that I desire? Who am I? But then, after who am I, or maybe that's not your question, the question may be, I'm not ready. You know, when I get 10 degrees, then I can do the thing that I want to do. I'm not ready. I need to learn some more things. I need to talk to some more people. I need some more advice. Then I'll be ready. Or I'm not qualified. Well, I was born on the wrong side of the tracks. And people that are born where I was born, we actually don't get to do these kinds of things. We don't get to rise to the seat of power. We don't get to enter those buildings. I'm not qualified. Or maybe it's simple as when I get my ish together, then I can X, Y, Z. Because maybe you look at your life and you say, my life is raggedy, or I'm really not doing well in this area, or this thing isn't good. So when I get that thing together, then I feel like I'll be, complete. And I won't have to worry about being seen as a fraud. Now, the other thing that we do when we're operating in the fraud complex is we compare ourselves to others. Oh, well, he's talented, but I'm not. Oh, she has the looks to do that thing, but I don't. Or he's smarter than I, that's why he's successful. Or she comes from money, so that's why she was able to do that thing. See, these are the things that the fraud complex talks about. And what I began to recognize is when we're letting this fraud complex rule our lives, we've actually forgotten about one of God's greatest gifts, and that's grace. And so that's where I got the topic for this message, Winter's Grace. And when we think about grace, I want to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. The first definition that I want to share about grace comes from Ernest Holmes in The Science of Mind. In the glossary, it defines grace this way. It says that grace is the givingness of spirit to its creation, And it is not a special law, but a specialized one. In other words, grace is, but we need to recognize it. It is not something God imposed upon us, but is the logical result of the correct acceptance of life and the correct relationship to the Spirit. Which is interesting. Grace is very much like love. I talk about it all the time. That love doesn't impose itself on us. It's here. It's always available. But love being what it is, it can't force its way into your life. That would actually be unloving, right? Grace is the same way. It's here. It's always available to us. But as Ernest Holmes said, we need to recognize it. It is not something God imposed upon us, but it is the logical result of the correct acceptance of life and a correct relationship to the Spirit. Now, A Course in Miracles, in the text of A Course in Miracles, it says something even more powerful to me about grace. A Course in Miracles says, grace is the natural state of every son of God. Hear that, not the son of God, of every son of God. So we are all the sons and daughters of God. There's not a son of God. Grace is the natural state of every son of God. When he or she is not in a state of grace, he or she is out of her or his natural environment and does not function well. Everything that he or she does becomes a strain because we were not created for the environment that we made. He or she therefore cannot adapt to it, nor can it adapt to him or her. There is no point in trying. A son of God is happy only when he or she knows that we are with God. Grace is the natural state of every son of God. I love that. And what's interesting about it, it's telling us that when we're not in alignment with that, when we don't accept that grace is here and available for us at all times, well, then life becomes a strain. Life becomes hard. Then we start to operate in that fraud complex. Then those questions about whether I'm worthy, about, oh, I'm not qualified, or oh, I need to get this thing together, then I'll be perfect enough to do this thing that I desire to do. And you can't adapt to the world. I love that it says that, so that there's no point in trying. The only point is to recognize that as a son or a daughter of God, you are only happy when you know that you are with God. So what does this have to do with winter? What does this have to do with December? What does this have to do with the holiday season? Well, the holiday season, in the traditional Christian view of the holiday season, we know that it's about salvation and grace. That the idea is that this child, Christ child, was born in a manger, and because of the birth of this child, the hope of this child, the presence and promise of this child, that we would all be saved, that the world would be saved. And so that's where the songs come from. I was listening to Oh Holy Night earlier today. It's one of my favorite Christmas songs. And it speaks and creates that sense of awe and wonder. Christ is the Lord. Oh, hear the angels' voices. And we have this idea of somehow this event saves all of humanity. But what we also understand, and we've talked about it in previous weeks, and we're going to continue to talk about it, our ancient ancestors understood that this salvation was not just about some human being or some person or some son of God being born. It was a literal reality for them, because they understood that this was about the sun. And so for them, it was literally the birth of the sun after the winter solstice was salvation from the long nights of bitter cold. It was that promise that, oh my God, spring is coming. The sun went away to the southern hemisphere and it got colder and we experienced the darkest night ever. But now, on December 25th, the sun has reborn. It's coming back. And that means that that we'll have more light. That means that the snow will not last. That means that rains are going to come. And that means that all of the things that we planted will grow again. And we'll have flowers and we'll have fruit and we'll have heat and warmth. They understood that no matter how bad or good they were, that the sun was going to return. And they understood that no matter how well they planned for winter or how abundant the crops were or were not, because we know agriculture can be funny sometimes, the sun would still return. It wasn't based on something that they had to do. It wasn't based on something they had to be. It was always going to shine. So that was their sense of salvation, and those are the roots and the seeds of where we get the story of the birth of Christ, where we get the story of the birth of Horus, where we get the story of the birth of Mithras. All the same story, all sons of God, all born on December 25th. But then we go deeper because the mystics understood that the birth of this child is a consciousness that is reborn within us every year. They understood that the birth of the Christ is actually the birth of the Christ within you, that the birth of the Son is the birth of the light within you, and we're reminded of it every single year. So when we talk about winter's grace, what are we talking about? Winter's grace is the promise that you cannot fail or make a mistake. Which is grace is the promise that no matter how unqualified you feel, there is something greater that qualifies you. Which is grace is the promise that you are supported through every season of your life. And which is grace is the promise that you have absolutely nothing to worry about because your mother, father, God is in control. Mother, father, God is driving the car. So as I was thinking about winter's grace and that topic popped in my mind, I began to hear a verse in the Bible, "My grace is sufficient for thee," which is a very, very popular and well-known verse and well-known story, and I want to talk a little bit about it. We find this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. This is the second letter of Paul to the church at Corinth. Now what's interesting about that, first of all, there are many letters that were written by Paul that we know beyond a shadow of a doubt he did not write. Okay? So we have to kind of side-eye many of those texts. But 2 Corinthians we know, and it is pretty much accepted by most scholars as an authentic text. It's something that Paul actually wrote, which I think is important. And what we find in the beginning of, in 2 Corinthians, in the beginning of this chapter 12, he's writing to the church at Corinth, and he's talking about himself and defending his role as an apostle. But he's hesitant not to boast about who he was. Now, the reason why this is interesting, because we understand that according to the story, Jesus had 12 disciples that surrounded him. After his death and resurrection, of course, they went out and preached and taught, and many miracles happened, and that's according to the story. But Paul wasn't one of those guys. Paul wasn't around. Paul wasn't there. Paul didn't have a first-hand encounter with Jesus. So, one of his complexes was this idea of, well, maybe I'm not legit, maybe I'm not real, and people would question his authority because it's like, well, you're not Peter, you're not James, you're not John, you're not these cats that walked with Jesus. What is your authority? Where does it come from? So this is the place that he was speaking from. Again, it's ironic. He had his own fraud complex, although he was the Apostle Paul. And he goes on, he's trying not to boast, and he's saying, I could boast, and he speaks of himself in the third person. I could talk about someone who was caught up into the third heaven and have seen things that are unlawful to speak. He's basically saying, like, I've been deep in meditation and gone out of my body and have experienced some amazing things, and the Spirit showed me some amazing things. I could talk about those things, but I would be boasting to prove who and what I am. But what I choose to do, he says, I would rather boast about my weakness. And he says, he tells the story, and again, this is a familiar story, where he talks about having this thorn in his flesh. Now, the other thing that's interesting about that, nobody knows what that is. He just says that, God gave me this thing essentially to keep him humble. We don't know what it is, and there's just absolutely no clues. Thorn in his side, thorn in his flesh. But it's very powerful what he talks about, because he says he has this thorn in his flesh, this issue, this thing, that sort of reminds him that he's not as great as he may want to boast to be. And he says, I had a conversation with God 3 times about it. And at every time that I had a conversation, God answers back, my grace is sufficient for you. And he goes on in verse 9 of that chapter, 9a. And this is in the New Revised Standard Version, and I love this translation. He says on the last time that he questioned God about this thorn, like, take this thing away from me, this infirmity, whatever it may be. And he says, the Spirit said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And this is where we must begin to understand what grace is really about, and as we have this idea about our fraud complex, because we're always looking at what we're not. We're always looking at how we're weak, right? We're always looking at how we think we're insufficient, but that makes room for the grace of God. That makes room for us to understand that it's not by your power, it's not by your might, but it's by the Spirit of God living and working in, through, and as you that allows you to be great on the earth. It's the Spirit of God in, through, and as you that allows you to be powerful on the earth. It's the Spirit of God in, through, and as you that allows you to be transformative on the earth in whatever way you're choosing to do. And it goes further in the next verse, verse 10. Paul is recognizing that truth, and he says, therefore, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong. And this is the piece that we have to understand when we look at our seasons, when we look at nature. One could say that the earth is weak in this moment. There's less sunlight, the trees aren't as beautiful as they are, there's snow on the ground and it's cold and it's hardened and it's frozen. But what nature is teaching us is actually, we understand that this process is necessary. We understand that the process of winter is necessary, the process of spring is necessary, because it brings about the abundance of summer and the abundance of fall. So we don't judge that. We understand that in its weakness of winter, it's made strong. And so winter's grace is a reminder to us that where you feel weak, where you feel like, oh, I don't know if I can do this because I don't know if I'm called to do it. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I don't know if I'm qualified to do this. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I'm not as pretty as him or her. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I'm not as tall as him or her. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because they have more degrees than I do. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I've never seen it done. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I haven't practiced enough. Oh, I don't know if I can do this because I haven't smiled and shaked enough hands. Whatever it may be, you recognize that, oh, my grace is sufficient for you and power is made perfect in weakness. Whenever I am weak, then I am strong. Because then it's not about your power. And this is the part I love. This is the part I love. See, we want to depend on our humanness. We want to depend on this flesh and blood, and we think that that's the thing that's going to make us great. It's not. Because you're not actually that flesh and blood thing. You're bigger than that. You're greater than that. You are spirit itself, created in the likeness and image of God. That's who you are. Course in Miracles remind us, I am as God created me. That's who you are. And that's the powerful part of you. So when we depend on what we look like, when we depend on the external, when we depend on what somebody else thinks about us, we are actually operating inverse. We're not operating from the place of power. The place of power recognizes that your flesh and blood self, the soul clothing, is weakness. But when I recognize that, then immediately I become strong, because then my strength shows up. That strength, that peace that passes all understanding. And I was reminded, actually just on yesterday, in the Course in Miracles, lesson 348 speaks about grace. Actually, most of the lessons over this past week has been talking about grace. God's grace suffices us in everything that He would have us do. So whatever it is in front of you, whatever you feel you're called to do, whatever it feels you're called to be, God's grace will show up to support you to do that very thing. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about what somebody's going to think. You don't have to worry about whether you're too qualified or underqualified. God's grace shows up and suffices in everything. And then it goes on and it says, and only that will we choose to be our will as well as His will. So again, we ask the question though, but whenever I am weak, then I am strong. How? How is that possible? It's possible because of righteous grace. Because we can look all through the earth. We can look right outside and we see weakness. We see the bitter cold. We see a frozen, hardened state. And unless you've experienced it, if you just came to this earth and you experienced this winter, would you think that it's going to be 90 degrees in a few months? Like, would you think that's possible? Would you think that if we're going to experience through the winter solstice literally the darkest night, the shortest time of light and the darkest night, would you think that in the summer solstice we're going to experience the most light? Would that even seem possible based on what you see? But we know the truth of nature. We know that it's going to be 90 degrees in a few months. We know that the flowers are going to show up again in a few months. We know that the sun is going to rise to its height and its power in a few months. What if you begin to look at your life like that? Where you see the winters in your life, and I guarantee you, as surely as we are in winter externally, we are also in winter in our own lives, in different areas of our lives. So what if you begin to look at the winter in your life and say, there's grace? Because I know just as it is true of this beautiful earth that I live in, that the snow always melts. Just as it is true of this beautiful earth that I live in, that the flowers always come back, that the buds begin to bloom and form on the trees. Just as I know that the fruit always grows again on the orange trees and on the apple trees. Just as I know that is true, I speak that truth within my life. That the snow shall melt in my life wherever it is frozen, in whatever area of my life. That the flowers shall bloom again in whatever area of my life that I desire for flowers to bloom. No longer am I going to live with this fraud complex. I'm going to live by grace. There's a quote that's attributed to Jesus. And I say attributed because it's not in the Bible. It says, empty thyself and I will fill thee. And what's interesting about that quote, the only places where you actually hear it used is from Hindu teachers and Hindu masters. And so it speaks, for me personally, as I've shared, there are thoughts and ideas that Jesus spent some time in India. And so it's my personal belief, this is not written anywhere, that this reflects some of the teachings that came through that time. Empty thyself and I will fill you. And this is what we're being asked to do in this moment. When we understand what winter's grace is, when we understand that we see the grace of winter in our environment, if we empty ourselves, whenever I am weak, then I am strong, I will be filled. Empty thyself and I will fill thee. Who was the I? Not Jesus, a man that was walking the earth, no. But the power of God, the power of the Christ within you, the hope of glory. That's Bible. That's Bible. Christ in you, the hope of glory. It's right there if we look a little closer. That's the power. The Christ consciousness within you is what will fill you. And that's what empowers you. That's what allows you to be great. We were having a discussion just recently, thinking about celebrities, and we see their perfection, and we see their life, and we think it's glorious and amazing, and we celebrate them, and we lose our minds. I talked about it during the Know Thyself series. But you are seeing your light. You are seeing the Christ in you reflected back to you. Empty thyself, and I will fill you. On that, I invite us all to stand. As we recognize that we are home in the I am. And we recognize that that's the truth of grace. We recognize that grace is. But grace is a loving thing. It is a loving act. It is a loving presence. And so it will not impose itself. We can accept or reject it. But what I know to be true is that when we accept it, we find peace. When we accept it, we find comfort. When we accept it, we find understanding. When we accept it, we find answers. When we accept it, we find clarity. When we accept it, we see life anew. When we accept it, we walk through life with our head held high. When we accept it, we can give that same love and light and compassion that we just gave to ourselves to somebody else. Empty thyself and I will fill thee. Mother, Father, God, we stand in this moment recognizing and remembering the truth and the power of grace. And we know that you are absolute unconditional grace in our lives, present in our lives now, just as you are absolute unconditional love, just as you are absolute unconditional peace, just as you are absolute unconditional joy, just as you are absolute unconditional perfection. And what I know you is that all that you are as our mother and as our father, all that you are as grace, all that you are as peace, all that you are as joy, all that you are as compassion is what we are, because your very spirit, your very presence, your very life lives within us. And as I know that your very presence and life lives within us, I know that that is the truth of who and what we are. We no longer cast our eyes and our presence on the physical. We no longer cast our eyes and our presence and make decisions based on the external, but we look within first. And as we look within, we are reminded that we are as God created us. As we look within, we are reminded that we are greater than anything in the world. As we look within, we are reminded that we are great without doing anything. As we look within, we recognize that we are always qualified, we are always called, we are always supported. And as we know that to be true, we choose to stand in this world differently. We choose to stand in this world supported by grace. We choose to stand into this world recognizing that just as the snow always melts, just as the sun always comes back, just as the flowers bloom, just as the trees grow new leaves, just as life itself begins to bubble over and become more exciting, that is the truth of any area of our life where we are experiencing challenges or difficulties. And so we speak to those challenges and difficulties now, and we remind them of winter's grace. We speak to those challenges and difficulties now, and we say that the nights do not last always. We speak to the difficulties and the experiences and the hurts and the challenges, and we say that you are temporary. We speak to the hurts and the challenges and the difficulties, and we say troubled, we find our strength, and we speak and call forward our strength now in consciousness. I speak a word of blessing over each and every soul in this room and each and every soul within the sound of my voice. For I recognize that we are in a time of transition. I recognize that we are in a time of change. I recognize that we are all experiencing the dark days of our lives. But I speak to their hearts, I speak to their souls, I speak to the truth within them, and remind that power, remind that presence, that you are greater than the difficulty, you are greater than the circumstances, you are bigger than the problems. And I call that power forth to rise up in greatness. I call forth that power to rise up in victory. I call forth that power to rise up as an overcomer. I call forth that power to rise up mighty and strong. And I am full of gratitude. I am full of gratitude, and I thank you, Mother, Father, God, for the ways in which we shall see and we shall witness our brothers and sisters overcome and be victorious in their lives, just as the sun always overcomes winter and shines back victoriously in the summer. So that shall be the truth of each and every person's life in this room and within the sound of my voice. We now release these words in thanksgiving. We now release these words in joy. Back into you, back into the cause which shall bring forth all things through your intelligent mind perfectly with ease and with effortlessness. Together we lift up our voices and we say amen.